Thanks, Scott. And I've been wearing glasses since I'm 7, so sometimes it's a product of age and sometimes it's a product of bad eyes. Thank you all for being here today and just being all together because this session is really about you, and most of our time is really being devoted to workshop to allow you to put your stamp, your individual and really collective stamp on the next phase, so that 3 or 4 years from now when we actually sit at another Mifgash, maybe it's in Dallas, maybe it's not, we actually know what we've accomplished, the blueprint we've created, and what success looks like. And this is part of that journey, and I'll walk you through that. So again, we're going to keep this reasonably short to allow for maximum time for workshop. We may have some time for a couple of questions. I'm always available, my email, things like that. If you have particular comments on the paper itself, feel free either to talk to me during Mifgash or email me afterwards or call me. So if the goal of the association, if the goal of the JCC movement is to measurably broaden and deepen Jewish engagement through our 160 network JCCs, what does talent mean? And at least in my view, talent's a little bit like love. You can't ever have enough of it. If you can recall, and this goes back a couple of years, this is one of the 5 building blocks, and Daron did speak about that yesterday. Obviously, talent is at the forefront. We could have put talent down at the bottom because at the end of the day, the folks we have that are working for us, the professionals that help lead and guide the organization day by day, are the foundation and the bedrock of everything we do. So what was the landscape? We obviously have about 1.5 million people that walk through our centers and our community camps every day with roughly, not scientific, but it's a pretty good estimate, 38,000 professionals, 6,000 full-time, 32,000 part-time. There's actually folks in this room that believe that's an underestimation. And I know for all of you that have worked in the Jewish community for a long time, Jews rarely underestimate anything. Thinking about the profile, and we've spent a lot of time talking about that, and I think you all see that. We now have 4 different generations of folks working at JCCs, from baby boomers through Generation Z, with a whole nother group coming their way through that are budding workforce, including my 17-year-old that's now on payroll, so he calls me his coworker. Our basketball director is more than willing to fire him at any point if he doesn't perform. The charge that I was given was to study the field and develop and adopt recommendations to strengthen our extensive talent development program through partnerships, collaborations with funders, peer organizations, and for us, a comprehensive talent and leadership pipeline that spans this continent. And rumor has it that Mexico City may be joining us. Daron and I joke about that. I call it J-NAFTA, if Mexico City joins us. And we really want to think about this continentally. What was the lens in which I sort of tried to look at this? Because part of the fun of this work was actually sort of stepping away from myself. So I'm sort of wearing these 2 name badges, because the lens I tried to create was sort of on my right, the lens of a national association that's looking at everything in the most macro perspective, and on my left, what it's like to be a fellow peer executive with 950, 1,000 people going through our payroll system every year and 145 full-time employees. So what does that mean when you have to work through both of those hats? I also wanted to reflect on my own experience. I didn't start in the JCC field. Some of you have been inside the JCC field for upwards of 40 years. Some of you are in your first year of JCC work, and some transition from lay roles into professional roles. So that is our landscape. So Scott told the great story, and there's many folks that worked their way through this system and built up, but that's not everybody's path. And part of this work is to actually talk about what does it actually look like to have to have the talent needs we need. We need to have the broadest lens possible. What does it look like to sort of go through 21 budget cycles, some of them more fun than others? As a consultant and advisor to the association, and in many ways, because I'm not beholden to the association, the idea of actually pushing back, but also the idea of really understanding and beginning to understand the depth of what does that look like on the inside looking out, and that's really been very eye-opening for me, because even sitting as a person that ran a couple of terms as a board member, it is different when you're inside 528th Avenue, and I have a very, very different perspective around all of that, and tremendous respect for incredibly dedicated, hardworking professionals, many of whom started in positions like yours. Who are the audiences? And that was one of the greatest challenges in sort of writing this. And the idea is to keep this as broad as possible, because we didn't want to have a different white paper for all of you sitting in the room and a different one for the Schusterman Foundation or the Mandel Foundation. We really wanted to write one white paper that spanned the field, recognizing that different audiences will have a different look at this, their own bias, their own perspective. Also the lay leadership that are guiding our movement, and the lay leadership for you. And there may not be a lot of time to talk about this, but for those of you that are involved in the Professional Development Committee of the association, Golly Cooks did an incredible work with our lay leadership around the culture that boards really create for CEOs and a healthy relationship to build talent. And let's face it, folks, it's not particularly healthy. There was a 2017 study that was created by this called Pipelines, part of Pipelines, and just about lay professional work around culture. Subject matter experts like Leading Edge, people that are in that field every day, the folks that actually have been gaining a different talent pillar at BBYO and Hillel International and places like that. And yes, we did raise this paper and got input on that from stakeholders and other prospective funders that are going to help make this to action. So this is a concurrent process. So here are the questions that we examined. What are the aspirations? And it is an aspirational piece. And we also know it's somewhat disruptive. What are its core components? How do we prioritize? And that's a big piece of today's workshop. What does culture mean in shaping the successful execution of strategy? Are we only going to focus on the C-suite, or do we need to look deeper than that? And while obviously the paper went much further than that, that's not where the questions began. The questions started with, should we just be focusing what it means to bring your C-suite? And if your C-suite is strong, then everything else follows. That was not the answer, at least in this author's opinion, that we got to. What's JCC Association's role in its movement-building work in providing the leadership Jewish lens around talent? What's already in place to support that strategy, and what investments do we need for a comprehensive field strategy? The conclusions, of which you've all hopefully had the opportunity to dig deep. There's no singular answer. There's no silver bullets. But there is a deep need to articulate and to continue to build an aspirational vision for this work. There was also a need to really define and cull recommendations in the following areas. And for those of you that have been in the field a long time, this may not feel exactly new, but at least in the JCC field, this is the first time that we're trying to bring a comprehensive strategy to light, or what feels intuitive to many of you, the opportunity to look at this more holistically and systematically, and ultimately prioritize what that all means. So let's look at recruitment, and what is that pipeline, and how do we attract people into this field? Let's look at career stages, because there's many inside our JCCs. What are the professional development needs to move people along in that journey? What's the Jewish lens that guides our work, the foundation of everything that we do? Where do we not need to reinvent the wheel? Where is there lots of room for collaboration? Where are there folks already in that space with whom we can work better? And what role does culture play? And I think all of you have seen how much the talent landscape, whether that be in the for-profit or the nonprofit or the Jewish world, is changing, and the role that culture plays in all of that. So here's what the last years looked like for me. A research and key informant stage, and that lasted quite a bit of time. Then we're going to call it the writing and vetting phase, both within and outside the field. So roughly at this point, about 35 different individuals, both within and outside the association, have offered feedback, and what I'd say is this is probably the fourth iterative draft that's been shared. Frankly, as you know, because you all work with boards, it's not easy to have 35 editors and to honor all that feedback. But we actually did a working session with the 12 execs that sit on the board here prior to Mifgash, and I think they would share, and they're all facilitating sessions today, or tables today, is we've really tried our best to honor the feedback. I don't think there's one person of those 35 where they didn't offer something that wound up in the next iteration, and in some cases, multiple pieces. And for that, I'm really grateful. So part of that learning for me was just stepping back and sort of seeing what can somebody offer? How do we honor that feedback? Where does that fit? Today's a really important day because there's folks out there in the field that Daron and Jen are ready to pitch, that they're ready to sort of send the draft. And I said, hold up, because this is a really important opportunity today to workshop and to actually prioritize and vet. When you actually count up all the action steps, there's 74 of them, and there's no way that you can do 74 action steps at once or maybe get them all done, period. It needs to be prioritized, vetted, and decide what actually is going to resonate through the field. And I think today's work is going to be exceptionally important because it's going to allow the association, as it begins to approach interested people in our talent building block, to say, and we sought the feedback and elicited feedback from 90 executives in the field. Then it's going to the board. The board has gotten a summary of the work we've done, but they have not seen the white paper. This started with our executives looking at it because we're the ones that are ultimately responsible for the talent, though we do need a culture within our field that supports that. So the lay role is critical, as well as some oversight work, and JCC Association's governance will have to sort of restructure its efforts to look at not just professional development, which is a subsection of talent, but really looking at talent in a much more holistic view. Development and implementation space. So development starts with development. We'll need to raise some of these funds to get early investments in to make a difference out there in the field. And then that has to develop and implement, and the prioritization will be part of that. I think that's it. Just a couple of highlights, if you saw this, and by the time I think this moves from white print to blueprint, Joanne will get to put her stamp. I think you can see the incredibly quality work that the marketing team does, and we'll really make this work. So, but I think what's really important is that culture really is everything. Culture does eat strategy for breakfast. Ideally, obviously, we have to marry culture and strategy. But I think the other piece is that when we look at talent as a building block, if you think about all of these areas around it, it is from pipelines, it is from recruitment and retention, it is about development, it is about having the right systems in place and having the right systems field-wide, a real talent management process, as well as succession planning. So how do we build all of those and marry them all and scale it through the 160 JCCs in our network? I think the other things that are different, because again, we represent different generations of practice within our JCC community. Some of you, 7 of you, are brand new in your JCC, and some have announced retirements, but some of you have not announced retirements, and you've been working in this field for over 40 years. So what does it look like? The 20th century Jewish landscape looks really different. I started my training in the 20th century in the Baltimore Federation, which was one of those, what it saw itself as a leading top 3 federation. And this was the system, and the Associated owned its agencies, right, Barack? And you couldn't fundraise, and you couldn't this, and everybody sort of followed that path. And I think very few of you work in that kind of landscape. One would argue we were more cohesive. I don't know whether we were more cohesive or singular in focus, but boy, there's a lot of wedge issues out there. If you look, obviously, within structures, much more hierarchically focused in the field in which I began practice to what the field looks like today and inside your JCCs. Little risk-taking versus much more new challenges. I would argue whether JCCs really have gotten into the 21st century workplace or whether we tend to be risk-averse. Obviously, the time horizons. Yes, there are still employees within JCCs that work 10, 20, 30, 40 years, but that's fewer and fewer, and we sort of see these 3 to 5 year tours of duty. And what does that tour of duty look like? So how do you build that ongoing pipeline, that training, development, and move people along? And I think the whole idea of career ladders versus lattices and how employees get challenged really has changed. This actually comes from Golly Cook's. And as we said, leading edge is doing the most pronounced work. I know there's about 30 or so JCCs that are part of the Leading Edge study that really talks about employee engagement, and I really encourage those of you that are not part of that process to really consider that. You really get an incredibly in-depth look at what employee engagement and leading places to work look like. I really cannot compliment the work that Leading Edge has really done to sort of help build the field and begin to articulate what does it mean for a profession to be a leading place to work. As you probably saw in the paper, if you've read it, part of this piece, besides a talent highway, and I think this may be JCC's sweet spot, is we can both attract as well as be an importer and an exporter of talent to the field. Maybe I speak personally because I didn't come in through the JCC system. I was a transplant. But if you begin to look at those career ladders and that lattice career, JCCs could be a very, very attractive place for employees to work, but we don't have to be the only place, which means that we have to have a field that embraces on-ramps and off-ramps. And I would really challenge this group to know whether you really do embrace employees that get off the JCC highway and what it's like to welcome people that are entering onto the JCC highway. And I can tell you, having survived the field, leaving Federation was not welcome by the Federation movement, and entering JCCs in 1999 at my first execs conference, I was not necessarily considered a welcome addition to the JCC movement. That's just based on personal experience. But if we're going to build a robust field, we have to recognize that we're not just building stronger JCCs, but stronger Jewish communities and a talent pool that supports that. And if we're the largest employer in the field, the more we go there, the better it can be. And Gali at least thought that could be the real game changer within our movement, and that we should, as the largest employer, benefit from this highway. Okay, so what are the 9 recommendations? Obviously starts with a comprehensive strategy, and that puts culture and talent at the forefront of our work because we can't do anything else without it. CEOs and their boards recognize that they create the cultures to allow us to grow and thrive. Start with the recruitment pipeline for entry-level folks. Begin deliberate retention focus amongst early career employees. Create mid-level retention and career growth strategies. We then move to the CEO level with C-suite recruitment and development, maybe not just at the CEO level, but certainly at the C-suite level. We need to be a field, we need to be a movement that adopts best practice human resource standards, and it never fails to surprise me of how many folks really struggle with that inside our field, but that's the world we live in now. Commit to the kind of training and development with the Jewish lens that allow not just our employees to thrive, but to thrive within an organization that has a Jewish mission and Jewish core values. And then I think the last piece, and we talked about Leading Edge. Daron talked about JPro yesterday, which was only 20 JCCs in the JPro system out of 160, so we got to move that number up. But if we're going to play in this League of Nations, if we're going to be a movement that leads, we also have to build collaborations. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, but we have to work with those forces in Jewish life that are also creating opportunities for us to grow and thrive and to open ourselves up to those kinds of possibilities. So where are we now? This is, well, let me stop for a second. We'll talk about the workshop in a second. Any questions? It's just like yesterday. All right, if people have questions, we may have time at the end as you're workshopping. I want to make sure people are moving and going. So let's go back to what that workshop is. You're all seated at tables with different recommendations so that we could actually maximize our time. We work pretty hard. Joy and I work pretty hard to sort of try to divide you by length of experience and size of city and size of region and different kinds of experiences you brought to the table so that at least within our closed network of JCC executives that we have as broad and diverse a group at each of these tables to dig into the action steps. So there's 74. There's some that have 14, 15 steps. There's some that have 5 or 6. But this is your opportunity to help us workshop because we did not put those necessarily in priority order. We put them as it developed iteratively, and we didn't want to prioritize them until we really went through this process with all of you. So facilitators, those execs on the board,